Thank you, Joanna, for that kind introduction. I want to thank Boaz and Miriam for this interesting conference, supporters at Lachomei Hagetaot, College of Western Galilee, Yad Vashem. And I want to thank my fellow conference participants. It's been 3 days of interesting conversation and continued learning. I'm going to talk about the Maurerschule, plural, bricklayers' schools in Auschwitz, although it's often referred to in the singular. There were several schools. They were recreated in different blocks over time. But in memory, they kind of mixed together as the Marischal, a bricklayer's school. And I'll talk using that kind of language. Thomas Gev is the pen name of a German Jewish boy from Berlin named Stefan Kohn, who at 13 years old was taken from Berlin to Auschwitz in June of '43. So he's in the Maurerschule in the middle section of a 3-year period I'm going to be talking about. Gev was an inmate from '43 through '44 and was later evacuated and transported to Gross Rosen and then Buchenwald in early '45. So I first learned about the Maurerschule in reading his memoir in my work on Buchenwald. At liberation of Buchenwald, Gev was so weak he could not walk around Buchenwald or go to nearby Weimar like most of the other liberated children did. And so he spent his days while convalescing drawing a series of more than 80 primitive watercolors depicting his many experiences in the camps. His father had gotten to Britain before the war, and he was doing this for his father. His father was his potential audience. And one image is of particular interest to us today. It is titled Maurerschule, the Bricklayers' School. And as Gev explained in 2 memoirs that he wrote, very good memoirs, first Youth in Chains and then Guns and Barbed Wire, there was a Maurerschule in Auschwitz that enrolled young prisoners to study and learn about building trades under the direction and mentorship of veteran prisoners. The school graduated most of its students, not all, but most, back into the main complex at Auschwitz I, to Birkenau, to Buna, to a number of Auschwitz satellite camps, including the Auschwitz farms, sometimes to mines, with varied assignments in bricklaying and construction. Under the title at the top of his picture, Thomas Gev wrote in German, but I'll say it in English, "It saved hundreds of children's lives." That's the beginning point for my investigation. What I'm about to summarize for you, some paper is too long to read, is a micro-study of a block or a space at Auschwitz that I undertook in connection with a testimonies workshop. I lead a workshop on researching and teaching with testimonies. We're trying to make this movement from being able to bring survivors into our classrooms to being able to use testimonies in creative ways. And since we asked all the teachers who worked in our workshop to get a project during the week of the workshop, I felt I needed to have a project as well. And there was this matter of the Maurerschule in the back of my mind. I had corresponded with Verena years ago about it. It was something I knew about, but I had never gotten a chance to go after the story. And so I took as my workshop project to see what testimonies could tell us about the experiences of those who were inmates of the Maurerschule. Now, as well as a micro-study of a particular space, those of you who know about micro-studies, they're usually closely detailed studies of particular spaces or towns or camps or even transports. As well as being a site, a space, this was a functional part of the workings of Auschwitz. It was created by the Nazis at Auschwitz, and it was under the central construction management of the camp. And just like the Sonderkommando were a functioning part of the camp, so too was the Maurerschule and the work of these boys in construction in and around the camp. Any good microstudy ought to begin with a set of questions, and so I began with the question raised by Thomas Gev in his painting. Was the Maurerschule a refuge and a haven? Was it a place of saving children's lives? Now, I'm writing a book on the rescue of children at Buchenwald, but there the underground carried out the rescue. And the blocks they created were separate spaces where the Nazi influence didn't fully penetrate. Here we have a block created by the Nazis, a part of the functioning of the camp. So it was an opportunity for me to look at a very different place than I've been writing a book about. Second question was the Marischal a school that equipped prisoners with skills, or at least with the reputation of skills, certification, that when they graduated, it thereby increased prisoner life chances in the concentration camp system? Right? Now, if you think the concentration camp system was a completely irrational place, this is a silly question. On the other hand, if there was some rhyme and reason to some of the things the Nazis did, maybe there was a payoff to have these skills or to be anointed as a graduate of the place to increase your life chances as you moved into the rest of the concentration camp system. Finally, my other question, and its in tension with the previous two, was the Marischal, like other blocks at Auschwitz, a place of terror, of brutality, of periodic selections for the gas, of selections for medical experiments, and more? And obviously, to the extent I found more answers to this question than the prior two, I would be revising what Gev told us. On the other hand, if I found more answers to the first two questions in a positive ways, I would be affirming what Gev told us. I also wanted a number of other questions to be answered. Who were these prisoners demographically? What was the makeup of the school? What was taught in the school and how, and to what sorts of forced labor did the graduates go? And finally, last, was this a change in reality year by year, or was, in fact, their change in the history of the Marischal from 42 to 45? And that's something I'm still wrestling with. My method was to work with prisoner testimony and memory. I have not yet worked with the International Tracing Service records. I will. So I have not confirmed everything, which I will. But I worked with a collection of memoirs by, testimonies by, and interviews with former Maurerschule prisoners to explore what they had to say about their experiences and to assess their memory and retrospective judgment about the place. All told, I found 7 memoirs, some 50 or 60 testimonies, including some multiple testimonies from the same individuals. I did 6 interviews. These boys were so young that many of them are still alive. I read scores of newspaper articles, thank goodness for Google. And I read several secondary works on the Maurerschule, the most important being Helena Yastrebska's work, who works with the museum at Auschwitz. And there's now a digital exhibition about the Maurerschule at Auschwitz. I broke the testimonies down into 3 groups. 19 individuals who were in the Maurerschule 1942 to 43, when it was in Block 7A. And all of these individuals appear on a block register that was found at Auschwitz in the days of liberation by the Russians. This block register is online. You can get it on your computer. It's at the Simon Wiesenthal Museum in Los Angeles, and it's a starting place for work on the Maurerschule. I also had a group of 4 individuals who were in the Maurerschule, including Gev, from fall 43 to spring 44, so a middle group, smaller than the other groups. And then finally, I found 15 individuals who were in the Maurerschule in late summer, early fall, through November 1944. And at that time, it was in Block 13A in Auschwitz I rather than 7A. So I worked with a total of 38 individuals whose experience spanned the full 2.5, almost 3-year period that the Marischal was operating at Auschwitz. This is a pair of pages from the register of the Marischal. It only runs from October 42 to June 43, but it's an indispensable starting point for people who are interested in this block and what went on there. It has names, it has numbers, so the numbers can be corresponded with ITS research. And most important to me, it also has their postgraduate assignments. And if you look down the column to the right of each of the pages, it mentions some people went on to work in various factories at the Auschwitz complex, just west of Auschwitz I. Some of them went to work for private firms that were under contract with the SS to build things at Auschwitz, whether those things were crematoria, nasty things like crematoria, or whether those things were oxygenation plants and sewage treatment things and stuff of that sort. These are some of the fellows in the first group who were there in 42, 43. I haven't put their names up yet because I haven't decided whether I'm going to use numbers or names. All kinds of issues of privacy, some of which we've been talking about among our group here. But the top picture gives you a sense of what these kids look like when they arrived in 1942. The block had actually begun in 40-41, but I didn't find any testimonies from the people who were in the block at that time. They were mostly Polish at that time, and I haven't seen them in the testimony collections I've looked at. 42, the Jews started coming in significant numbers, and mostly Polish Jews and French, Slovak Jews first, and then French Jews, and then Polish Jews. And these are some of these men in the recent decade. Pictures taken from their Shoah Foundation testimonies. It gives you a sense of who you're talking with when you look at testimony. And sometimes I have pictures from their testimonies, which appear at the end, of what they looked like at the time. And these were young boys. The Maurerschule included adolescents and young men, but I was interested mostly in the adolescents and youth. They were 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. Okay? I'll come back to these guys in a second. This is the middle group, a smaller group. Thomas Gev is on the left. These are German Jews and Greek Jews, Jews from Salonika. And fortunately, I know two of these individuals, and two of them have written very interesting memoirs. So the memoirs supplement the testimonies. Oops. And this is the third group, which I got very taken by. These are all Polish Jews who arrived in late August of 44 at Birkenau from the Lodz Ghetto. They were very young, almost all 13 to 17 years old. And they became a group in the Marischal, and they remained a group as most of them came to Israel and began commemorating just 20 years after getting out of the camps. The fellow at the top, I will tell you his name. A number of us who are participating in the conference have been adopted by families here, people who are important for the research we're doing. We've all had roughly similar experiences. And this is my adoptive family. This is Gershon Ben Yehuda, who lives in Rehovot. He was the convener of the commemorations for this Polish-Jewish Lodz Marischal group. And he's gone back to Auschwitz 7 times with his family. You can imagine that. Always to Block 13A, which is now the Gypsy Memorial. But he has the right to go anywhere he wants. And they go up to the attic where the block instruction took place. I want to say a few brief things about the curriculum of the Maurerschule. It was a school. Real learning did take place there. It was divided in terms of principles and practices of building construction. There was the study of building materials and their composition, not just brick products, but natural stones and artificial stones. Most important was the preparation of mortar, so that you could make walls that were strong and that could be joined together. There was some math taught, basic calculations, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction, also some basic measuring. And the German language was taught. The boys were in school from 8 to 5 every day, 6 days a week. Sundays they had off. So these kids were kids who were living on the second floor of these Auschwitz I barracks. And they were going up to the upper floor, the attic, where the instruction took place. And they built walls, and then they took walls down, and they built walls, and they took them down again. And they learned by doing, in a very untheoretical, kind of clinical sort of way. The graduates of the Maurerschule helped to build and expand barracks, both in Auschwitz I and in Birkenau. They worked on expanding factory halls in the nearby industrial area. One important place was the German equipment works. Many of them worked on that. They built vegetable storage facilities. Those who were put on farms built pig pens and stables. Most sadly, many of them worked on the crematoria in Birkenau, especially crematorias 5 and 3. And they helped build at Auschwitz I and at Buna as well. At Buna there was a separate Marischal. I'm going to go back to this register just to give you a sense of where people went. Among those in my testimony base are Moshe Dach and Joseph Engel. They have very good testimonies at the Shoah Foundation. And here they appear on the right-hand page, assigned to Riedel and Son, which was a construction company under contract to build the crematoria at Birkenau. They were sent to the company on March 25th, I believe, and there were 2 crematorias still in construction that didn't go online until April and June of 43, and they worked on those. That's the kind of detail that doesn't come through in testimony. That sort of precision is absent. Mostly they say they worked construction, they worked in Birkenau, and they move very quickly through the topic. Unless you're armed with a document like that where you can make testimony more precise, it's very hard to track things. In addition to working on construction of buildings and of gassing facilities and crematoria, they also worked on drainage ditches, waterworks, water purification systems, oxygenation works, and fire prevention ponds and more. So there's a wide variety of construction tasks to which they were assigned. And it's very hard to nail this down and answer as precisely as one might want. Did this help you in your subsequent work? Is it one of the reasons that you remained alive? Because obviously they remained alive to give testimony. So, in overall summary, reading the memoirs and testimonies and conducting the interviews, what did the former youths of the Marischal say about the block? All of them agreed that the block was a place of amazing cruelty and terror. In specific, many of them pointed to the Blockaltester, the block elder, a German criminal by the name of Alfred Uzuki, who had been convicted of murder before he was in Auschwitz. And they say that he brutalized the students and punished them fiercely, forcing constant deep knee bends, administering whippings and beatings, and worst of all, pouring cold water over the youth outside amidst the dead of winter. Almost every memoir, almost every testimony of people who were there in 42, 43 starts here to describe the block. This was everyday existence for them. Some of them also tell stories of periodic selections taking place in the block. SS would come, and some boys would be sent away, never to be seen again. Or some boys would be picked out because they couldn't jump over a bench, or things of that sort. So this was an unpredictable, fearful place where there were constant tests, people disappeared, and sometimes were sent to the gas. Over time, in the testimonies, one learns that the prisoners learned to guard against these events when the SS appeared. The SS who did the roll call count, the SS who showed up, they began to learn how to put people in the right spaces during the lineups so as to hide and obstruct the view about smaller people or less healthy people, and to protect one another because of that. The other thing that is most talked about among the testimonies is that this was a place of selection for medical experiments. These are the experiments in sterilization and castration conducted by Dr. Horst Schumann and assisted by the Polish doctor Władysław Dering, in which boys were taken out and castrated in block 21, first in May and then a second testicle in November of 1943. The number who suffered this is as yet unclear to me. Alexandra is the expert on this, and we've been talking back and forth about this. But I estimate there's at least 12 to 16 boys pulled from the Maurerschule. But it's not because they're in the Marischal. They have already been caught up in the experiment and have been sterilized before they got to the Marischal. And so Auschwitz reaches in and pulls them out and does this stuff to them. And they return to the block. So everybody knows about it. So everybody's in a block where people know that you could possibly be pulled out and have your testicles disappear. The testimonies are a little bit less clear on this one, but I believe the Marischal was also a place of possible sexual abuse. 4 of the 38 testimonies mention peopling, boys who are doll boys for functionaries in the Maurerschule. But there's a taboo against talking about it. In fact, people talk about the taboo against talking about it. So we don't know this for sure. We also know that this was a place of constant sickness and diarrhea. And when the night sheets were looked at in the morning, people who had been sick and who left telltale signs of that on their beds were sent to the hospital. And the hospital was a place that some people didn't come back from. So there was fear with respect to being sent to the block for castration. There was fear also with respect to being sent to the hospital. In the statistics that Helena Jastrzebska has developed at Auschwitz, she believes 22% of the youths and young men in the barrack between October 42 and 43 died. Now, that's a pretty good statistic for Auschwitz, where the rates were much higher. But this was no place of, as we say in America, peaches and cream. Some of the work assignments were also horrific, and that's another reason they don't talk very much about them. Not very many people in their Shoah testimony say, I built the crematorium at Birkenau. That's not something to take great pride in. So that's a little bit obfuscated in testimonies. But all told, this is on the negative side. This was not a place of rescue like the block I'm writing about in Buchenwald. On the other hand, what else did the youthful prisoners say about the Marischal? Bezalel Rengewirtz, whose name was changed to Raimi in the United States, and who's the grandfather of Sam Raimi, the Hollywood director who made Dark Man and several other movies, says, and he said this in 1984 in a testimony, the Marischal, in a way, saved my life. For him, it was a place of respite from harsh work and winter for 3 to 6 months. Something I don't know full well yet, but there are a number of people there who are not there for 3 months, they're there for 6 months. Somehow, if they didn't finish the course effectively in 3 months, they got to stay and do it over, kind of left back. That was a place of real respite. For him, it was a refuge. Joseph Engel, one of the boys who went to the Riedel and Sons and built the crematoria at Birkenau, I think maybe obtaining building skills in the school helped me to survive. Right? It's an acknowledgement that I was in a special place, I got some special stuff by eating the place, and that helped me to survive. It's the reason I'm here. Thomas Gev began this kind of talk in his memoirs by talking about the Marischal as an asylum of sorts, which saved many lives. And Moses Helion, a Salonican Jew, a Greek Jew, writes in his very interesting memoir, being in the school was an extraordinary benefit. Even despite the fact that these same people in their testimony knew that there were castrations being carried out on boys in the block, even though that they knew sickness and diarrhea and going to the hospital meant you might not come back. It was a place to them that provided better conditions than being in Birkenau or in Buna, where some had been before they were selected for the Marischal. While they were there, they slept in bunks with straw. There was no work on Sundays, and they were able to shower with cold water throughout the week. Another thing that comes up in the testimonies, many of them talk about this, that the conditions of mutual aid among the prisoners were better here than elsewhere. Many of them say explicitly, in other barracks I was in Birkenau, it was everyone for himself. That was not the case inside the Marischal. Yes, there was some space and enough sufficient kindness that there were several ethnic group clusters in the block. Gev talks about a little Berlin, a little Warsaw, a little Kiev, and a little Salonika. And there were explicit friendship clusters, usually in pairs or trios, smaller groups, usually of boys who came from the same town. And that's the way they were selected. They came in off the transports, then they were selected into the Maurerschule, and often boys from the same town were together in the Maurerschule. And they talk about their friendships with one another, and they talk about calling each other by name, not number, inside the Maurerschule. A number of them write that their teachers, or speak that their teachers appeared devoted to their learning, and that there were no punishments if you dropped a brick or if your wall fell down. There was patience, although things tightened up when the SS came to watch. This one I'm not sure about, but some of them write that the Block Altesta became a political red rather than a green criminal at some point, and that may have helped conditions in the block, but it's something I need to check further. And then most boys were assigned by the Central Construction Command to commandos of construction, often as mason apprentices, with the name Mason Apprentice next to their name. And some of them, not all, but some of them worked in fairly benign conditions, often outside the camp, which indicates that learning and skills acquisition and certification did lead for some to different kinds of work that was survivable. But it was a crapshoot. You could as well be sent to the mines, as well as, or to Birkenau, as well as to the farms. Much surprising to me, and I'll end with this observation, some boys took a craft pride in what they were able to do as a consequence of being in the Maurerschule. They speak in their testimonies and sometimes in their memoirs with pleasure of joining walls together, which is a real skill, making walls of great strength, which is highly emphasized in the Marischal, doing edges, which is really tough. You have to graduate to doing edges. That's advanced work. And in one particular case, doing windows and arches working with a plumb bob. And some of them went on to do construction or electrician kind of work in their careers after liberation. I want to close with the last group of boys in the Marischal, the 250 Polish Jews from Lodz Ghetto, who were selected for work by an infamous height test. Everybody begins their testimony by talking about this height test. They quickly learned what was going on. Some of them sandwiched somebody else who was too short between them, so they appeared taller. And they all have a story about getting into the Marischal. Now, if the Marischal was a terrible place, they wouldn't highlight this story. They were tall enough, or they feigned being tall enough, to get in, and those of inadequate height, unlike them, were sent to the gas. They learned in the Marischal, just like the ones before them, how to build walls and tear them down, and they were told, or they came to believe, that they were going to be rebuilding German cities. Right? They had no sense of how the war was going. They didn't have information about the progress of the fronts, either east or west. And then, in late November '44, as Auschwitz began to engage in pre-evacuation, they were sent on a transport to Sachsenhausen, where they arrived in Block 11, headed by a German political red who took interest in them. And then a few weeks later, they were sent to Lieberose, Jamlitz, near Cottbus, where they were all listed as Masons' apprentices in the camp records. And they were supposed to be working for a German firm to help build a project that included a drill ground, barracks for 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers, and a residential village for returning SS officers from the east. They began digging plots in the forest, but because of the progress of the Red Front to the east, they never built the barracks or the village. They were evacuated from Sachsenhausen on a death march. They were sent by trains to Mauthausen, where they all witnessed cannibalism in the camp, terrible place. And then they were liberated in bad shape by Americans at Gunskirchen. This group became so close to one another that of those who came to British Mandate Palestine, and most of them did, they became a surrogate family for one another. And they reminded me of the Buchenwald boys I visited in Melbourne. They were as tight and as close, coming to each other's celebrations and weddings and bar mitzvahs for the last 65 years. I conducted a second interview with Gershon Pelter, who's now called Gershon Ben Yehuda, with all of his family participating, most knowledgeable family I've ever encountered. All had been to Auschwitz 7 times with their father. Whenever he couldn't answer a question, there was a phone tree going on with those individuals who didn't want to be interviewed, but were there as consultants to answer very technical questions. So it was an amazing interview. I felt like I was interviewing 3 or 4 people. He's going back to Auschwitz for the 8th time this September with his extraordinary family. And like Gev, like a number of other people, he is one of those people who knows how bad it was and acknowledges how bad it was. And in particular, in these guys' case, the death march was the worst part of it. But who knows, especially by the way he brings his family back there, that the Marischal meant a good deal to him and a good deal existentially to the family, which would not exist had he not been in the Maurerschule and gone through it. Thank you for your attention.